Hello and welcome. Today we're going to make some sandwich bread. It's pretty easy, just a little bit of time involved. So let's go over the ingredients and then we'll jump in and start making our loaf. Alright, for our ingredients we're going to use 4.5 cups unbleached flour. You could probably also use regular all-purpose flour. This is going to give it a slightly more chew than all-purpose flour would. We need 1 2/3 cups warm water. We want this between 90 and 110 degrees when we use it, simply because I'm using active yeast and I'm blooming that, although I've heard you don't need to anymore. And with instant yeast you wouldn't need to at all. 1 package of active yeast, of course, which is about 7 grams or 2.5 teaspoons. 2 teaspoons salt and 1 tablespoon sugar. We're actually that's to help the yeast along, and I'll explain that when we get there. You're also going to need some butter or grease or oil to line our pan with. Alright, now the first thing we're going to do is, if you have active yeast or non-instant yeast, essentially, you're going to want to bloom it. I guess, I've heard you don't have to do this anymore, but I still do it because that's just kind of the way we've always done it. And what you want to do is have your water between 100 and 110 to start, generally. You can go as low as 90, but generally you want to be in the 100-110 range. I'm going to put our sugar in here. Now, a lot of recipes will have you put that in the dough itself to help it out at that point. I actually find that makes bread a little too sweet for my tastes. So I mix my sugar with the water and then I pour the yeast in, and we're going to let that bloom, which just means to hydrate. And basically it's going to wake up all of our yeast. And when it's fully bloomed, it will look like this. And once it reaches that stage, you know it's ready. And that means we are ready to start mixing the dry ingredients. And by dry ingredients, I mean all the ingredients. So, what I've done already is I've made a well in the center of our flour, and I'm putting salt on the outside because technically I've been told that it could hurt the yeast. I don't think it will in the mix this way. And then we're going to pour our yeast and water mixture into the center. Now that's still going to have a little bit of the sugars in it, so that'll help the yeast along. And I'm trying to get sandwich bread consistency, so I'll explain where I get that in a bit. And what I'm going to start doing here is, as you see, just kind of mixing it inwards and outwards, and I just want to get everything formed up into a shaggy dough and then kind of turned into a dough ball. And before it's fully like mixed past the sort of formation of dough, I'm going to let that rest for a little bit, and I'll explain why once I do that. Now what you're seeing me do with my hands is the same thing I was talking about on the last video, where I'm making a circle so that I can keep the inside and the outside, and I'm splitting the two sides. So the whole amount of it is going to get mixed together, instead of like parts where you might have an uneven amount of, say, flour in one section. That's not going to happen when you mix it this style, because you kind of break everything up and crush it all together. Now, if you're doing this, you're probably wondering, like, hey, my hands are getting covered with dough. You'll notice that the farther we get along in this process, the less your hands are going to get covered with dough. In this case, mine are a little more than I wanted to here, but once you go back into it, and I do apologize that, the bowl's up there. Should have been down a little bit more so you could see it better. But, as you can see here, the dough is starting to come together and get to that point where it's coming off of your hands. It's also past the shaggy dough. It's forming the initial dough ball at this point. And hey, look, now you can see it. You can also see that it's starting to come off my hands pretty good. By the time it's done, it's going to just come right off my hands. It's no big deal. Now I'm just going to take the bowl scraper real quick and get everything in there for the last little bit. And this is what's going to, like I said, it's going to make it into the dough that you're thinking about. And the reason I want to do this on the sides is just to make sure it's nice and clean and we get everything in there the first time. And like I said, I'm just going to keep doing that same motion where I'm twisting the outside to the inside and spreading everything so that everything is fully mixed. As you can see, it's now starting to just completely come off my hands. You don't have to worry about your dirty hands. It'll take care of themselves. You're still going to want to wash your hands. Anyway, this will take about another minute or two of mixing, so let's just jump right ahead to that. Alright, once we're done and it's fully formed, we're just going to put a towel over it and let it rest for about 10 minutes. Okay, so once our 10 minutes has passed and the dough is fully rested, it shouldn't rise much at this point because it's still just starting to rise. Now that is going to factor into how long we do things and what we do later on. What we're going to do at this point is we're going to knead the dough, and essentially we're just going to be stretching it out. a lot of gluten already formed when it rested and while we were making it. That's what gives it the chew that you have in bread, but we don't want to form too much gluten because we're going for sandwich bread. So I'm going to end up kneading this for a little under the 10 minutes that I would normally knead bread. I would go 10 to 15 minutes if I wanted to, say, a French loaf, but in this case I want sandwich. So I'm probably only going to knead this for about 7-8 minutes and just make sure that everything's hydrated and everything's fully stretched out, so that way we're forming gluten, but not so much that it's going to be like a rubbery mess, or even, and that's not a mess, the texture of like a really good French baguette. You could make that out of the same recipe here, but it would be how you treat the dough at this stage, where you would knead it for a much longer time, and you would make sure you layer it more, and you would only proof it once so you didn't knock the air out of it, whereas we're going to proof it sort of 1.5 times. And we will get to that. It's a little different. But again, there's specifics I was going for, and I'll explain what I did and why I did what I was doing there. So basically with kneading the dough, you're just going to be pushing it out, stretching it. You don't necessarily have to fold it like I'm doing here. And you'll also sometimes use what you just saw me do, where you saw me tucking the inside to the outside. And I'll actually jump ahead here to where I'm doing that towards the end of this, and you can see what that is, and just sort of making a ball out of the dough and getting it all together. And what this allows us to do is start forming how the outside's going to look. Now, I'm not really being choosy because this is just for me having sandwiches, so I'm going to leave my bread not super smooth on top, and not a perfectly, round dough. And as I was motioning there, if you're pushing down with the palm of your hand, you can just keep going in small sections and push it out. And when your wrists and forearms start to get a little tired of kneading, and they will, that's what I was talking about the dough ball, what I'm doing right here. It's a little too soon in the kneading, so it'll start sort of tearing as you do it at the moment, but once I get to the end of the kneading, it'll stop tearing. And that's at about the 7 or 8 minutes. And since I'm going for sandwich bread, that's actually what tells me that I've gotten to that point, is that it stops tearing. So let's jump ahead to that, and I will explain what we're going to do at that point. All right, and jumping into this is pretty much when it gets to the point where I can feel it in my hand. It starts to feel more springy, would be a really good way to say that, actually. It starts to feel like it's pushing back on you. Now what I'm going to start doing is just kind of taking the outsides and rolling them into the center, as you can see here. And what that's going to do is that's going to start forming how the top and outside of the bread's going to look. I'm not super worried about it being like insanely clean or anything like that, but this also helps us out when we're going to do our proofing. And what it does when we're doing our proofing is all that sort of wrinkly mass that we're pushing into the bottom is going to rise out and sort of fill the spaces, so you won't have weird looking bread and it won't have strange curves. The one thing with this I'm going to do is I still need to get it out and see how it feels. Make sure it stretches and comes back. And once I know it stretches and starts coming back a little bit more, then again I can just start going back to putting it on the inside and then forming our whole dough ball. And once that dough ball is ready, we're just going to take it and put it back in our mixing bowl. And we're going to put the towel over it, and we're going to put it in an area preferably warm. We're going to proof the dough one time before going into the loaf pans, and then we're going to proof it like kind of a half a time again afterwards. And the reason for that is I want to knock down some of the big bubbles of the first proof, but I don't want to form any big bubbles on the second proof. And I'll explain that as we go, because I do the first proof and then the second proof is after I put them into the loaf pans. If you're looking for a full-size loaf of bread, you're only going to use one pan, where I'm going to use two. And that's because the ones that I'm using, I want something a little shorter. And I will explain that while we're doing the loaf pan. So into the bowl, cover it with a towel, and we are good to let it rise for the first time. Now, again, keep it in a nice warm area, and it should hit about double in size. Alright, and the last step before we are ready to do our final proof, while it's doing the initial proofing and doubling in size, we're going to grease our baking pan. Depending on what you have, you may not need to do this. Like if you have a non-stick, you could probably get away with not doing it. I still do it, even though I'm using non-stick. If you have glass, you will absolutely need to do this. If you have Aluminum, you will absolutely need to do this. Pretty much any type of thing that is a non-stick, you'll have to do this with. Now, once I've got the pan greased, the easiest way to do this for me, and this is how I was taught in school, was to just toss some in and start tapping it around. And you just kind of want to keep it moving. And you'll notice as I'm doing this and I'm tapping it around, the flour just kind of slides across it and covers everything in a fairly light coating of flour. This also means you, in this case, you won't be able to see much flour on the outsides of it at all, of the bread at all. In my case, almost none, because of how the two loaves go into the loaf pans. So, speaking of that, if you want a full-size sandwich loaf, you're going to want to use one loaf pan for this recipe. I want mine a little bit smaller because most of the meats that I use for bread and sandwiches are smaller, like Genoa salami, pepperoni, that sort of thing. So I'm going to do 2 pans, but that also means that my loaves are going to be about half the height. For one full-size loaf, you would use just a single pan with this recipe. Once you're done tapping it around, you can dump out the end of it, and you are good. Alright, once your dough has doubled in size, we're going to turn it out to our work surface, and in my case, I'm going to cut it in half to divide between the two. If you're doing one loaf, you won't need to do that. Now, when you cut this in half, and you're working it into the shape that you want to put in the loaf pans, which is just basically going to be kind of straight across, you want to be really gentle. Like, you're going to notice I'm not really handling this very hard. And I'm just going to gently sort of roll it out, stretch it out a little bit, and I want to knock down some of the bubbles, but I want to keep almost all of them still somewhat there. I don't want anything to get completely knocked down. And I'm just going to roll both of them around the counter and just kind of very gradually thin them out into a slightly longer shape. If you're doing the one, your bread pan is going to be full after the first one, so you won't have to worry about this. If you're doing 2 half heights like I'm doing, you'll want to do this, and you just want to go gently. And then once you get them back into the 2 tins, well, not back into, but into the tins, we're pretty much ready. We're going to look for it to double in size again, which in single loaf pan is going to put it at about an inch and a half above the height of the pan. In the double loaf pans, it means that the sides will have completely started to touch the outside of our pans, but the 2 ends will not. So for my double loaves, doubling in size looks about like this. One's a little bigger than the other, which is not so great, but it's fine. And if you're doing a single loaf, that's, like I said, going to be rising above the top of the pan by about an inch and a half to maybe 2 inches. If it's 2 inches, it's probably a little too much. And once it reaches that stage, we are ready to go in the oven. We're going to go into the oven at 350 degrees for about 30 minutes, and we're looking for 190 degrees on a thermometer. Same type of meat thermometer you'd use for anything else. Once it hits that 190 degrees, once that's taken up to 190 degrees internal temperature, or about 30 minutes if you don't have a thermometer, it should look about like this. Now, the reason it doesn't look sort of golden brown like you see in every YouTube video and all of the stores is because we're using a slightly lower temperature. You could go a little higher of a temperature, but that tends to dry the outside of the bread out a lot more in homemade bread than it does in factory-produced bread. They have dough conditioners and all kinds of things that help them with that. In our case, it's not quite as golden brown as I would like to see it, but it hit the right temperature. The dual vampire marks on both loaves show that it was attacked by a thermometer, and once it hit about 190 degrees internal, I pulled it, even though it wasn't 100% golden, because that's going to keep it nice and soft, and for sandwich bread, this is very, very important. And with that, our bread is done. So, now you know how to make a quick loaf of bread for sandwiches, and we will make some more bread soon. I have a sourdough episode I'll do just like everybody else on the internet for right now. So, if you enjoyed yourself and learned something, I ask you to like and maybe subscribe to come back for more. I should have videos out 2 to 3 times a week for the next couple of weeks. So, thank you for watching and enjoy your meal.